Welcome to Kids Health Revolution Radio with Deborah Morgan. On our show, we'll discuss natural and alternative health approaches to help children who have chronic health concerns. You'll hear from professional health experts and fellow parents who have used these proven methods to improve the health of their children, and you can too. If you have questions or topics you would like covered on the show, please send an email to Deborah@kidshealthrevolution.com. And now, here's Deborah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kids Health Revolution, the podcast. We are back with another episode of information, inspiration, and of course, the tools that you need to make sure that you are able to help your child and recover their health, take their health back. And we are here today doing an interview with a gal that is local to my area here in Calgary. And I'm really excited to chat with her about traditional Chinese medicine. And I'm going to be honest here, I'm a little out of my wading pool here. It's not something that I personally know a lot about. And that's part of the reason I'm really looking forward to chatting with her today and finding out more about what this particular branch of, I guess, what we would call alternative or complementary medicine can offer to our kids. As a lot of you who've been following my story know, we've been on this healing journey with my son for quite a few years now. We've accomplished a great deal of healing. I would say we're probably about 95% recovered from his autoimmune condition, but we have reached I don't know if I'd say a little bit of a plateau, but things have really kind of slowed down. And so I'm always looking for additional supportive things that I can do for his body or that next step that I need to take. And so traditional Chinese medicine has come onto my radar. And so I thought, well, I'm going to interview Erin today and talk to her about, how this helps our kids. And at the same time, I can be sharing that information with you, and you guys might be interested in taking this as your next step, or maybe it's your first step before you start doing things with gut health and changing the diet. So really looking forward to chatting with her today. So let's introduce Dr. Erin. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, and then we'll bring her on. So she is a registered acupuncturist, as well as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. Excuse me. She has 8 years of post-secondary education and runs a general practice here in Calgary, Alberta. We will have contact information for her at the end of the show in case you are here in Calgary and would like to get a hold of her. She cares most about supporting people to feel amazing, which we would all like, and of course like for our kids, to help them achieve their goals of physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being. And she does this in her practice through the use of acupuncture, herbs, moxibustion, cupping, oh boy, I'm not sure I'm saying this one right, gua sha, ear seeds, which I'm interested in hearing more about, nutrition, and of course lifestyle. Her approach is holistic and focused on safe, non-judgmental experience. Love that. TCM has very effective tools to remedy the everyday ways that we feel sick, unbalanced, or not ourselves. And she says that it is her privilege to see how these tools that she uses can improve her patient's health in so many different ways. So welcome to the show, Erin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So Erin, I want to make sure everybody has your full name, and I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's Erin Legare Tremblay.
Okay. So Erin Legare, and Legare is spelled Legare, and then Tremblay. And we, again, at the end of the show, we'll make sure that we give people your information on how they can get a hold of you. And of course, I'll have it in the show notes as well. Does that sound good?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So Erin, I always start off the show, I always like to hear a little bit about people's personal story as to why they chose the field that they're in and sort of the complementary or alternative medicine route.
Absolutely. Yeah. For me, I did about 10 years of social care work. So I was working in group homes as an educator, as a case manager, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was really noticing that, especially in my last position, it was with an employment program for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And I was finding that actually a lot of people were having barriers because of their health, not because of necessarily something that they had congenitally been born with, as we would sort of traditionally think. Mm-hmm. So I really kept finding myself wanting wanting to be in the process a lot earlier, because a lot of times I was working with people and they were on 10 different medications. Their health was in a place that they weren't even really sure where it was anymore. And so I really wanted to be part of the process earlier than that. And I started seeing TCMD because I had benefits. So I was like, let's try this. And I had actually never experienced healing in that way before. It was just really profound, really gentle, really exciting, actually. Yeah. And I walked out of a treatment one day just feeling incredible. And I was sort of floating down the sidewalk and I was like, oh, I want to make people feel like this. And it just sort of from then on really flowed. So every decision, every step just seemed really easeful. And even the application process, it didn't seem hard somehow. It just sort of, it just moved really easily. And and even though school was challenging, every step was really joyful. And so, I just kind of kept moving down the path and just kept falling more and more in love with it. Yeah.
Right. That's, you're on the right path, right? When it's joyful, and even though it's challenging, there's joy in it. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
Love it. And so tell me, I'm intrigued by this, this idea that you wanted to get in and be part of the solution earlier. What sort of group home were you working in? Was it for adults, or was it for youth, or where were you?
Yeah, so I've done actually quite a bit of stuff, but predominantly it was with adults. But I've worked here and I've worked in other countries even, but just, sort of with lots of different populations. I've been really privileged to work with all kinds of different populations. And the last one was, as I say, like an employment program, trying to help people, get into the workforce.
I see. And were you seeing people that were struggling with, issues with, mental illness and things like that you felt, if we just jumped in a little sooner here, we could help prevent this?
I was, I felt that my personal opinion was that things could have been a lot better for a lot more people. I think that there's been so much effort and so many people try so hard, but there really aren't the services there for mental health that as individuals, I think we would want for ourselves and that we want when we need them. And that was one of the things that I found really exciting about Chinese medicine, actually, was that there were so many frameworks and there were so many tools to work with mental health. And I found that really exciting, even just for myself, like even, Yeah,
I love it. So I just really like this idea of being part of the solution earlier, right? That sort of an ounce of prevention, so to speak, right? And getting in, and how much earlier can we get in there than when our children are young, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because there's something, it's really heartbreaking to work with an adult and these symptoms were already showing up in childhood, and there's like, well, what could have happened for this person if there had been that support earlier?
Exactly. It's one of the things I talk about a lot is if our children are starting out life with eczema, asthma, and allergies, let's fast forward to when they're 45. What are they going to be struggling with then? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. As it's compounded and gotten worse. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, so we have so much power and so much opportunity as parents right now in our kids' lives to help, step in and what's the word? I'm looking for some lovely euphemism there or some sort of metaphor, but it's not coming to me. But, we do have a lot of power to come in and make change now so that our kids can live to their full potential for their whole life, right?
Absolutely. And I love that you say opportunity, that there's that's so much more joyful way of looking at it as well, right? There's this wonderful opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Beautiful. So let's chat a little bit about TCM in particular, and maybe give me the general overview about what that is, and then we'll maybe jump in and get a bit more specific as we go.
Absolutely. Yeah. So traditional Chinese medicine as a whole is actually a really varied concept. So the way we think of it now is usually with the capital TCM, and that's sort of post Mao. And it's this idea of holistic healing, so that everything in the body is connected. I think lots of people are familiar, at least with the diagrams of the meridians.
Yes.
Yeah, this idea that the whole body is covered in meridians that really govern the flow in the body. So whether that's blood flow, chi flow, neurological flow, but that everything in the body needs to move and flow appropriately. And so we can use things like needles, Tui Na, which is the acupuncture massage, gua sha, which you pronounce perfectly. Yeah, absolutely. Cupping, all these different things to help the body heal itself. So it's very much this idea of an empowered body that's very capable, that isn't something that's sort of dirty and needs to be punished or cleaned, but this idea that it's very powerful and that we just need to give it the tools it needs to heal itself. And so it's a really beautiful system that has lots and lots of different layers. So in the same way that you see in stuff like Ayurveda or yoga, where there's different schools or disciplines, you'll see that in Chinese medicine as well. So different sort of lineages that will approach different issues in different ways. And there's many, many different frameworks that one can look through. So what's really neat then is that if one particular system isn't working in a particular situation, you have all these other options to look at it and different ways that you can pull tools from it.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
and you'll...
sorry, I'm just going to jump in with a question there. So do you sort of specialize in one school and then just pull things from other schools, or how does that sort of work?
I find that I certainly have my favorites that I use, and definitely the ones that I use the most are probably the ones that my teachers use the most as well. Like it kind of moves down, but it's what's really exciting is that it's something that you're always learning. So there's always a new layer that can be added, and that's really exciting, so that even people who've been practicing for 50 years are still finding that there's new and exciting things for them to learn about. So yeah, and so I find I shift depending on the person and what they want and what they're needing. Yeah, and then I kind of pull the frameworks that make the most sense for that.
That's great. So if it's not necessarily a rigid process, it's an organic process depending on what the person needs and what their body is telling you. And if your usual toolbox is not quite getting it, then you're able to do a little investigation and reach into a few other toolboxes to find things. Is that right?
Yeah, that was perfectly said. Yeah,
awesome.
Absolutely.
Great. So let's talk about a little bit more about this idea of the meridians and the flow of energy. And as I understand it, I studied a little bit of the applied kinesiology type stuff, so like Touch for Health and that kind of stuff. So I have a little bit of a general understanding about that. So the meridians governing the flow in the body, and are we talking on an energetic level here? Is that right?
Yeah, so this is where it always gets really interesting, and you'll hear, I think, really different answers depending on who you talk to.
Okay.
So the traditional idea was that chi flowed through these meridians. And I think chi is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and people are always kind of unsure about what that means. So it can be very energetic based, very almost esoteric for some people. And then it can also just be really clear in terms of just like the energy your body actually uses to function. So the ATP your cells are using to do their work. And one of the ways that I've heard it explained that I really liked was the idea that the meridians are sort of the meta flow of the body. So they control all the flow. So they control, the neurological system, lymphatic system, blood system, like all these systems in our body that we know from a Western perspective do have to flow and move. The idea is that the meridians sort of govern all of that flow is sort of a way of thinking about it. And then some people think about it more in terms of the meridians interact more with the neurological system. Like a lot of the functional MRIs and stuff that are coming out now show a different perfusion in the brain depending on what points you use. So one of the theories is that it sort of interacts with the neurological system just to alert the body to something that needs to be healed, or sort of allow the brain to focus on what needs to be healed so that the body can do that work. So there's lots of different perspectives on it. Yeah. And they can range from very, very esoteric to kind of, like I say, based more on like a functional MRI.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So if somebody were to come to you with a child that has some type of health condition. I'm not sure it really matters if we get specific at this point, but they come in and their child has got some sort of chronic health condition that they're frustrated with, and they're not happy with, what modern or what's the word I'm looking for, mainstream medicine is offering them. Let's walk through what that would look like. How would that go?
Absolutely, yeah. So with children, it's interesting because the appointments will vary in length from an adult one. But usually what would happen is an initial intake where the parent and child would come together. And generally, for example, for myself, I would speak with both people, like to have a really good conversation with the child and also a good conversation with the parent, to really get a good sense of where the frustration lies, what kind of things are being experienced. And the conversation would talk about what was happening from more of like a Western, or like you say, the kind of more modern health perspective, but then also just holistically what's happening. So like, how is sleep? How is digestion? How is energy? How is everyone feeling just day to day? Like all the different factors that go into that. And even things like, what are hair and nails doing? What does body temperature feel like? Like all the sorts of different things to really get a good sense of the whole and not just that particular thing that they might be experiencing. Yeah.
Not that symptom focus, but
exactly
talking about the symptom, but then going deeper.
Absolutely. And oftentimes people too, like they'll kind of give me things that they think aren't really relevant, but it might be really relevant and interesting for me to know. So we'll have like a really good conversation, and really try and establish a feeling of, like safety and comfort. I think especially for children, right, it's really important that they feel like they can talk, that they feel like they have a choice in what's happening, that they feel like this adult that they're talking with isn't scary or any of that kind of thing. So that's a huge part with children as well. And then with children too, the decisions around what treatment modalities are really important. So for adults, acupuncture is almost always the case. Like, it's very uncommon to have a consult with an adult and not do acupuncture, but it's actually relatively common with children not to do it.
Okay.
Because it's really important that the child is okay with it. And just no unnecessary terms, like it's just, if they're not okay with it, then it can't happen, right, in my opinion. Yeah.
For sure. It's not going to be helpful, right, if they're so anxious about it.
Exactly right. And I find too, like the comfort with needles actually can increase quite easily. Like, I've even had times where like I've let children put needles in me, and then we've done like one needle, like we just sort of play for a bit. And then they can decide from there if that's something that they want. Right. So we may work more with nutrition. We may work more with things like cupping or herbs, of that kind of thing. Cause herbs can be just the dosing changes based on body weight. Right. And so there's lots of different things that we can pull in just depending on what that person is looking for. And so then, we'd either do the acupuncture treatment that day if that was what they were into, or we do the cupping or the things that need to be there physically. And then they would be sent home with the other modalities to do at home that would work for them. So whether that's, like we say, ear seeds, or I might even send them home with a gua sha tool of their own, that kind of stuff. So there might be things that the child can do, there might be things that the parent can do, but then they'd be sent home with that. Because I also think that Chinese medicine is very much about empowering people in their own lives, not being based on you have to see this quote unquote expert all the time. And it's very much a folk medicine. It was the medicine that parents did with their children for a long time before it ever became something that professionals, quote unquote, did. Right. So there would be hopefully a lot of tools to take home as well.
Right. Awesome. And I think that's what the whole shift that I think is happening in the medical care model, and I hope is just going to continue shifting, is instead of seeing it as this omnipotent sort of doctor that you see and you go and they give you some sort of treatment and then you leave and carry on with life as usual. That actually the power is really very much in our own hands and what we do in our day-to-day lives, right?
Yeah. And that's so exciting. Like, I find even just in my own life personally that's so empowering. Like I find that really fun.
For sure. Me too. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So when you're doing the intake, am I correct in assuming that all of the information that you're gathering in that intake starts to give you sort of a picture of where there may be, and if I'm using the right terminology here, sort of blocks in the flow in those meridians? Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the one framework would be like, are there particular meridians that are experiencing blocks? So, for example, you would see this in if someone's getting eczema along one meridian, or if they're having pain in a particular meridian, or like the symptom itself is falling on the meridian.
Okay.
But then there's also other frameworks. So, for example, the five elements is a system where all five elements in nature correspond with meridians, correspond with flavors, emotions, different sense organs, different tissues, all that kind of thing. Like they have corresponding characteristics. And so sometimes we might pull something like that out to see. Especially deeper pathologies or things that aren't so sort of simply at the surface. Yeah, so you might kind of pull out like what is happening constitutionally, what is happening now at the moment. And then there's also looking at stuff from like a chi, body fluids, blood perspective, looking at it from like internal, external. Like if we're thinking about someone who's actually caught a pathogen of some kind. So there's these different frameworks, or even just the most basic would be sort of like the yin and yang, or what yang is often how people pronounce it, but yeah, sort of this idea of yin and yang and balance in the body.
Right.
So yeah, there's these different things that we might pull out. And yeah, definitely as they're going through the intake, it's linking up with different things. And so then we can see, okay, which frameworks are going to be the best for this person? Where are they fitting on that? And then what are the relationships and how do we, then pull the treatments in?
Right. Interesting. Okay. So there's all kinds of different things that you're finding out, all kinds of different information you're gathering as you're doing that
Absolutely.
interview. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you can go in and, you find out there's an imbalance here and there, and that's where you decide acupuncture, maybe some cupping, some herbs. You're approaching it on a multifaceted sort of way. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay. And would you would you start with all like a few different approaches at the same time, or do you sort of layer them, like say start with cupping and then layer in some herbs, or how does that work? Does it depend on the situation?
Yeah, it really depends on the situation, even just the desires of that particular person. I've met patients who are like, let's do everything now, let's get it all, like really aggressively treat this. And then for other people, like it really works better to work more sort of step by step, intentionally, slowly. So it really just depends on the person. And it also depends too, like if someone's in a really deficient, worn out state, we don't want to throw too much at the body at one time. So yeah, it sort of depends on the personality of the person, their condition, and their desires. So I really like to frame my treatment plans basically on what people themselves want
and need. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes what they want and what they need can be two separate things.
Absolutely. And that's where the balancing act definitely comes in for sure.
Yeah. And I find that working with parents and the clients that I work with, sometimes we're in a hurry, and I get it. I was there with my son, just throw it all at me.
Right.
Let's get this fixed like as quickly as we possibly can. But then I realized that wasn't going to work. And so we needed to back off. And I don't know, you can tell me if you share this opinion, but I think when we're working with kids, sometimes being a little bit more slow and gentle and methodical about it can be better, rather than trying to push their little bodies too hard.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And actually in Chinese medicine, there's a theory too that children, their ability to heal is quite a bit higher than ours as adults. So you actually have to go slow sometimes so that you kind of don't overshoot.
Right.
Like you want to go slow so that you can see their response, because it's often going to be faster than we might expect for ourselves as adults. So the idea is you want to go slow, one, like you say, because they're small, we need to be gentle with them. And also because their ability to heal is so remarkable that we might actually overtreat. Like we might kind of go too far the other way.
Right.
So I think definitely slow, gentle, and with a lot of participation and consent from the child is definitely, I totally agree, the best way.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I really like that, the idea of over treating, that you could, if you throw too much at it at once, you could swing them into a different sort of imbalance. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Awesome. So I'm curious, you mentioned something about how when you're doing the intake interview with people, and this happens to me in my practice as well, so I'd love to hear an example from you of maybe something that somebody brought up that they thought was completely irrelevant, but it actually turned out to be quite important for you from your perspective? Can you think of an
Oh,
example off the top of your head? I'm kind of putting you on the spot.
no, that's perfect. I find it's usually in like really small details.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be things like that someone sighs a lot, or that they get a weird taste in their mouth, or
Mm-hmm.
um, let me think of a good example. Yeah, it's usually in those really small details, or that that they get cold in this particular way, or like they'll sort of just be something that they'll tack on at the end,
Right.
and there's often like followed by like, I don't know if that's important, but
Mm-hmm.
then it'll sort of be the linchpin and being like, oh, okay, this is definitely like a pathology in fire, and this is what's going, like it kind of provides the confirmation of what's going on.
Right. So that
Or
piece, all these little pieces of the puzzle
Yeah,
matter, right?
absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of times, too, certain symptoms in Chinese medicine could be several different pathologies or patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those smaller details that show you exactly where they
Mm-hmm.
fit or where
Mm-hmm.
it'll fall. Like, for example, headaches, they can actually be many, many, many different types of patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the times people don't think to tell me if their headache is heavy, for example,
Mm-hmm.
but that's going to actually be really useful to me. So yeah, then
Interesting.
that's what actually narrows it down to the particular pathogen or pattern that they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. It's like
Mhm.
fine tuning, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Like when we take our car to the mechanic and explain the funny noises it's making, right?
yeah. And they're like, okay, I'm gonna try and figure out where that's actually coming from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So, I one of the examples in my life, and I don't know if for you, if you do this in the intake, do you go into like family history, like the parents' health and even grandparents' health and that kind of thing?
I do a little, like it's definitely on the intake form as a written question.
Yeah.
And I like that because then it allows people to engage with it to the extent that they would like to.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think for some people that's really important. They really want that to be included.
Yeah.
And for other people, they kind of want to keep that private, or that's sort of separate from what they see their work with me being.
Right.
So I like to kind of allow it to be a written question for that so that I can kind of judge that.
Mm-hmm.
And I often just let it come out in terms of like, what of your family history are you worried about? Like there's a lot of things that happen in our family history that we're kind of like, oh, that doesn't matter. But there's often those one or two things that, we're really worried about getting ourselves.
Right.
To me, those are the ones that are the most interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for children, definitely there's a little bit more of an interest in how the parents are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And even more specifically than that, like how the parents were doing at the time of like pregnancy, birth, like that at that time period
Right.
too. That can be somewhat interesting or informative as well.
Tell me about
Um,
that. How is that interesting and informative for you?
yeah, so there's in Chinese medicine, there's this idea that congenitally we're given the essence of our parents,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is just a different way of saying what we think in the West, right? That we get the genetics of our
Right.
parents.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this idea that the health of the parents at the time of conception, the health of the person during pregnancy, was there stress? Was there not stress? Was there, wonderful, joyful eating? Was there not? That those things really impact the congenital condition of that person. So, especially for children, like a lot of things that happen chronically, and at a really young age can be because of the health of the parents, and not in a blame way, like not in a they did something wrong way, but just that those factors can influence what's happening now. And so that can be really informative. So for example, even something like a lot of ear infections can be that there was a deficiency at some point for parents. So yeah, it's informative in that way, just to kind of give us again some more narrowing down of what the pattern might actually be for this particular child.
Uh-huh. That's really, really interesting. It's interesting to me because I always look at family patterns related to the gut and the microbiome. But,
Yes.
I also know that there's more to it than that, just as you say, and stress is something that I think is huge.
Mhm.
And how our stress when we're pregnant and in early childhood and all of that stuff, how that sort of passes on to our children.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because in China, in some areas of China, obviously not everywhere, but there is this idea that like, while someone's trying to conceive, they might be receiving treatments. And then while someone's
Mm,
pregnant, they might be receiving treatments. And then that children, when they're born, might actually be receiving some herbs and things like that, just to sort of set the child up to be as strong constitutionally as possible.
lovely.
And so that's really neat. And even things like the fact that children, will get things like, well, before vaccines for sure, but like things like chicken pox and measles and things like that. So
Hmm.
there's this idea that we treat children when they're first born for those kinds of pathologies that will show up later.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
we're starting to see a little bit of a shift here in the West towards some of that. A lot of the world where I circulate, there's a lot of talk now about, eating, ideally for your body, not just when you're pregnant, but ideally, 2 or 3 years before you even get pregnant, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's neat too, even during birth, like looking now at the microbiome and how that's affected even just by birth.
Hmm.
That's so exciting that these things are starting to become relatively mainstream, actually,
Fairly
which is
modern.
really,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm really I'm pleased to see that. So look, I want to dive in and talk a little bit more about this stress piece. I'm quite curious about it. Something sticks out to me about it, and partially that's because of my own journey with my own son, but I think it relates to a lot of conditions, especially from what you're saying. I know that my son's condition, he has an autoimmune condition, and it's vitiligo. And I know that they do say that there is a sort of a stress slash potential trauma associated with that condition. Now, I've gone back in his life and I can't seem to put my finger on any particular major sort of traumatic events in his life. But there was some stress in my life at the time of my pregnancy. So if that were the case and we were to talk about that, how would you proceed forward in trying to address something like that? Is
Ooh,
is
that's a
that
good question.
yeah? Am I being too
Hmm.
general or?
No, no, that's totally. It's really so the idea. One of the ideas in Chinese medicine is that stress sort of stops flow, like it.
Mm-hmm.
So wood is the element that's meant to really control flow,
Mm-hmm.
and so the idea is that stress and anger together really stop it. And the analogy I often give is it's sort of like being stuck in traffic. So
Mm-hmm.
you know exactly where you want to be and where you're going, but nothing can move. And so
Mm-hmm.
then all the symptoms that kind of come up with that. I do think sometimes there's a somewhat of an overemphasis on stress as a pathology. Like
Okay.
I think it definitely plays a part. I think it's really important, and I think especially what I'm seeing, living in a Western North American context,
Mm-hmm.
is that stress does play a huge role in our lives, and then we live in a world that's you know has certain characteristics, and so that plays out in people's health.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't necessarily always think it's the root of everything.
Right.
And I think we live in a society that's kind of focused on that
A little quick
sometimes.
to jump to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what concerns me with that is with parents. Then I see a lot of like a blame game being
Right.
played. Like,
Yeah.
well, like if you hadn't been there, then your child would, And I don't always think that that's very useful or helpful. And I think what's really important now is like, how is this particular child experiencing life now? What are the
Right.
symptoms? What's the pattern? Um,
Mm-hmm.
because there's going to be lots of great tools to use, and so I don't think we always need to worry so much about the past, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
I definitely think it's useful and important, but not at the expense of sort of overly focusing on it or blaming or using
Mm-hmm.
a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really understand why that's the case, but I just see so much guilt being leveled on parents,
Yes.
and I think that sometimes. I think pretty much 99% of the time, like that's not useful or, yeah. So I think like, especially if, for example, your child right now is not having a stressful life, that things are, going really well now, then
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the really lovely things actually about Chinese medicine is that it's very much based on treating what's happening now.
What's present now?
Yeah, so like you might get a totally different treatment 1 week to the next because how you come to the treatment table that day will be very different.
Mm.
So there's this, even there are actually some traditions of Chinese medicine that say you would even treat differently depending on what time of day it is.
Right.
So there's very much a focus on meeting the pattern where it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Is there this idea that something can become sort of stuck in the body, like a particular experience or energy or something that, let's say, blocks flow, like you spoke
mhm.
about the anger and the stress? Is there the possibility, I've read some things that can kind of get stuck at a certain sort of area in the body or be blocking something, and that we need to start that flow moving so that can kind of be processed and move off, so to
Yeah,
speak.
absolutely. Yeah, you put things really well. Yeah, there's definitely the sense that things can be stuck. So it could be even like a pathogen getting stuck, which I think is interesting. Playing out like with Western medicine, sort of thinking of certain chronic diseases being like a latent pathogen now, and certainly, yeah, emotional experiences or different things that have happened can be stuck for sure. What I love about Chinese medicine though is that there is much more of a hopeful attitude towards these. So it's just like, yeah, something got stuck, and now we use these tools to get rid of it.
To get,
You
yeah,
know,
to let it flow out.
yeah, where I think that sometimes what I see in more Western thought is this idea that like something gets stuck, it's terrible, it stays there forever. You'll have to work so hard to get rid of it. Like there's sort of, like that if they've had this experience, then it gets stuck for so long, and the only way forward is to suffer for years of treatment kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, but I think in Chinese medicine there's a much more hopeful attitude that like sometimes the body just needs a little extra support, and then it will deal with that as well.
Yeah, that's really, I like that. So let's visit that bit about the pathogens, because I do talk about that a lot when we're addressing gut health and things like that, because we see a lot of dysbiosis, and that the microbiome's been thrown off and all of that kind of stuff. So how could TCM help with that if we're addressing things like that in the body?
So do you mean in terms of gut microbiome or just in terms of pathogens in general?
Well, both.
Both, yeah.
Essentially. I mean, let's use an example of, let's say, Candida. Lots of the kids that I see either have Candida, or maybe they have C. diff, or some sort of imbalance like that that's contributing to their health issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chinese medicine sees pathogens very much the same way as nature. So there's this idea that pathogens would be categorized based on like something like wind, heat, cold, like these kinds of things. So that we're looking at the nature of the pathogen and how it's entering the body. And a lot of it is very similar to Western medicine in that like either the pathogen is too strong or your body wasn't strong enough to fight it off. So there's different avenues to go. So there might be that we use herbs, for example, to get rid of a pathogen, or we might use cupping is a really lovely one actually, especially for colds and flus.
Okay.
So there's some really neat things that can be done in terms of, like when someone's just feeling like they're starting to get their throats a bit tingly, there's really neat things that can be done in terms of herbs, gua sha, and different like practices to stop it from happening. Then if it does happen, there's different herbs and cupping, for example, to get rid of it. And then if it proceeds beyond that and the body hasn't successfully been able to get rid of it and it's now become latent, then there's new tools to get rid of it from that perspective. And then sometimes too, what I'll find when I'm working with someone is they may, because of the severity of the pathogen, may choose to use something like a pharmaceutical to get rid of it. And then we'll come along after with Chinese medicine and clean up the side effects of that. So for example, antibiotics, right? So after someone has taken antibiotics, then we can come in afterwards and look at the gut microbiome. We can look at, the deficiencies that might have been caused by the pathogen itself, by the antibiotics, all of that kind of thing. So what I like about it is that it can work with different modalities as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
And in terms of, let's say, like a pathogen like parasites, I know that's something I see a lot with my clients is parasites. It's amazing what can come out of some of these children when they start addressing
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really weird. I get pictures of poop on my phone from clients. They're like, oh my God, what is this? So what would we do in terms of TCM for that?
Yeah, so there are actual herbs that can be used for pathogens. Like for actual things of that nature. Yeah, parasites. Thank you. I'm finding that not a lot of people use Chinese medicine in this way. Like they exist, but I don't think people actually think of Chinese medicine when they think of having a parasite. But certainly there's even ancient texts talking about parasites and formulas for them and stuff like that. Yeah, right. Because not really that new. So which is really interesting. And the other thing that I find really interesting, just kind of go off the question a bit, is the idea of like the gut microbiome being so problematic, especially at least in my context here in Calgary, and I'm sure yours too here, is that what I noticed in school and what we sort of saw and learned was that a lot of people had what we would call sort of stomach yin deficiency. So for people who aren't as familiar with yin and yang, yin is sort of substance of the body. It's sort of what can be seen on an MRI. It's what can be seen and touched and physically exists. And we sort of always were thinking, well, like people work really hard, they push themselves really hard here. And so that causes this yin deficiency in the digestion. But as I've come into practice, I'm really starting to explore the idea that that's actually the lack of microbiome. And I'm wondering to what extent, and I'm still exploring this, but the idea that to what extent is that actually the problem, but we wouldn't have had the language of that in Chinese medicine because it's a relatively new sort of set of conditions. Yeah. So that's been like a really interesting way of looking at things. And certainly when I bring gut microbiome into my practice, I'm getting better results. So, so I think it's really neat to sort of look at, like with old frameworks, looking at new conditions, and they still work and they're still useful. And that to me seems really beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. This weird question just popped into my head, and I have all these other questions written down, but I'm going to ask this one anyway. Do particular pathogens or parasites or whatever, do they have their own sort of energetic frequency that you approach at all?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's why it's so interesting to look at things in terms of nature, because then you start to pull out like a character of that pathogen rather than just, oh, it's a virus, oh, it's a bacteria. Like there's this idea of like what are the characteristics of it. Right. So a way to kind of illustrate that would be, like, you often hear people say take ginger or mint for your stomach problems, right? Like if you're having issues with your stomach. But what's interesting to me is that if your stomach problem is that you have a lot of heat, so think of like burning, a lot of heartburn, a lot of appetite, these kinds of things. If you put ginger in there, that's going to make it way worse, right? If you put mint in, that's going to feel amazing. And usually people know this, like they'll crave something different than maybe what someone else is telling them. But the idea is that if you understand the character of the pathogen, is it causing excess symptoms? Is it causing deficiency symptoms? Is it causing heat symptoms or cold symptoms? Like these kinds of things. Is it still on the surface or is it gone really deep now? These give you all kinds of different ways of coming at them, which I think is really lovely. And there's different ways of doing that. So for example, viruses and bacteria, like for bacteria, for example, is usually quite hot, like it causes heat symptoms, and antibiotics are actually quite heating as well. And so it's almost like this fire with fire condition. Wow. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're always using the opposite, but certainly there are lots of interesting characteristics. And even like you'll see conditions where nothing is showing up in Western testing, like nothing. They can't find anything, but the person knows that they don't feel well. And so then understanding the profile of that pattern becomes even more interesting or useful, right? Yeah. Because now we can treat it because we understand what it feels like energetically or what it feels like. And what's neat about Chinese medicine is it can work either way. So like I'll have people come in and they really need to talk about it in a very energetic terms, and that works really well for Chinese medicine. And sometimes people need to come in and they need to talk about their X-ray and that's all,
concrete physical terms.
Exactly. And so Chinese medicine can kind of come in on either one of those, which is really lovely. Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my other questions I had for you. So one of them was, this is something that we are exploring now with my son, and I know that it is an issue for a lot of children with any chronic health condition, is this level of toxicity in the body, because we live in a fairly toxic environment. My son was exposed to mercury because I had a mercury filling changed when I was pregnant. So things like that. So how is that incorporated into your practice?
That's a really interesting question. I've actually been really thinking a lot about this lately because I find that a lot of patients are coming to me with this kind of framework. And in Chinese medicine, it doesn't often look at things that same way, if that makes sense. Like the idea of toxicity is sort of a foreign one. So there's idea that like I said before, the body is really considered very, very capable. And so its ability to manage toxins, its ability to do all that is considered really superior. And so we just need to, perhaps if the toxicity level is higher than what the body can handle, then we need to just make sure that we're, obviously reducing what we can of the toxicity and then tonifying the body itself. So I mean,
You
there are
mean by tonifying, you mean sort of supporting the body?
yeah, absolutely. So strengthening the body or regulating the body depending on what someone is in need of. But there you'll see fewer like cleanses or sort of purging protocols in Chinese medicine. Certainly they exist, and certainly the idea of purging as a remedy is still very useful depending on what we're talking about. But yeah, there isn't sort of this sense of, this herbal formula will remove this toxin. But certainly, again, we're sort of looking at the symptoms themselves. So if someone has a lot of heat and that's from an external source, it doesn't actually matter specifically what the source is. I mean, insofar as once it's removed, like once that person's not being continually,
intoxicated by it.
Exactly. So that's kind of the neat part about it sometimes too, is that we don't always have to find out exactly where it's coming from. We can kind of look at the symptoms and then kind of move our way backwards that way. So that can be really useful for people who aren't really, it's nothing showing up for them, or maybe don't have access to some of the testing that would reveal those things. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because they can be costly for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's neat. Like, I mean, as a TCMD, I can send people for those tests, but I've actually found in my practice yet that I haven't needed to.
Right.
And that just maybe be based on, the types of people who have come to see me. But so TCMs can send people for testing for sure. Okay. So if that is something that someone is interested in. But yeah, I find that usually the frameworks that we have don't really need them. And oftentimes what I'll do is I'll start with the simplest solution. And then if that doesn't work, then we can move to something as costly as food sensitivity testing or metal or that kind of thing.
So the testing that you're sending them to, would that be sort of the more private testing, or is it through the Alberta Health testing?
Yeah, only private. Any of the more medicine, like AHS for us and like other areas, would go through their doctors. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I thought. Okay, good. And actually, just as a side note to listeners, that's other than the fact that there is a bit of a cost involved with it, a lot of these private lab tests that we do are more sensitive in picking up some of these either pathogens or toxicity or things than some of the standard things that we have just through our healthcare system. So that's just something to consider, a side note, so to speak. So I'm really curious about gua sha. What is gua sha?
Oh, yeah. So gua sha it's also called sometimes spooning or scraping, but there's different materials that the tool can be made of, but it's a handheld tool with a flat edge. And so oil is applied. It's usually done kind of on the back of the neck, the back, these kinds of areas. And basically the tool is like kind of scraped down the skin. Scrape sounds really violent. It's not actually, it's like, it actually feels quite nice. And it can be somewhat painful depending on the purpose of it, but it doesn't have to be. So yeah, basically this tool is scraped along the tissue. It's basically what Graston's came out of, if people are more familiar with that. And so, yeah, chiros sort of do Graston's, which I really feel was based in gua sha at some point. I could be totally wrong, but that's sort of, it's exactly the same thing, really. And it can be used in different areas of the body, certainly where there's injury or pain. And so the idea is that it sort of brings circulation to the fascia and really helps to speed healing along, especially when we're talking about like tense muscles or, like I say, post-injury. But in Chinese medicine, it has an extra level in that it helps with wind heat pathogens. So it was often something that like a parent would do for their child when they were starting to feel sick. And it can also help for things like sunstroke and things like that, where there's a lot of heat in the body and it needs to come out fast. So a lot of people that I know who grew up in Chinese homes, or like at least Chinese heritage, would have had their parents do that for them. Like it's a very folk medicine kind of thing. Yeah. And so often what I'll do with my patients is I'll do it with a jade tool and then just give them the tool afterwards, because stones like that can't be disinfected. Yeah. So then they can take it home with them and do it themselves if ever they need, like if they're having pain or if they're feeling like a pathogen's coming on. But the reason it's called spooning is because of the ceramics spoons that like you'll see sometimes in Chinese restaurants, that those would be the tool that would have been used sometimes in someone's home.
Okay.
But they can be, right? Exactly right. Yeah. But it can be made out of all kinds of different materials, including like a stainless steel, so that it can be disinfected. Yeah, and so it's usually just for no longer than 5 minutes, and it leaves some pretty intense marks on the skin. Like it looks quite scary, but it can often make people feel better like right away. It's wonderful.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Is it something you would use for anxiety?
Ooh, I like the way you make connections. Yeah, you absolutely can. Yeah, because anxiety is often this very like hot sensation, right? It's this over agitation, active, moving kind of feel. And so draining heat for people who are experiencing that kind of anxiety can actually be lovely. Yeah. Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely.
So if you perform it in your office and then you give people the jade tool, are you sort of explaining to them how they could do it at home? Like if you have a
Hmm.
child and you did it for him, and then
Yes.
I could do it for him at home.
Absolutely. I think it's one of these ones that works really well as a tool for people to take home, like literally and figuratively, that they can use when they need it, and then it doesn't depend on a
Having to go
professional.
to an appointment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right. Because it
Yeah.
shouldn't. Like it really shouldn't. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is it something that you, I guess, I mean, this is going to depend on the condition and the situation, but is it something you would do daily if somebody was experiencing, a flare up of the symptom that it's for, or, once a week? What would that look like?
I think you would probably get different answers depending on which person you were talking to.
Right.
I personally don't like to do it before the skin has had a chance to heal again. Like I just don't think it's necessary.
Right.
But certainly it would be, if someone was feeling like they're getting a cold, they did it, the next day they were still feeling like the cold was a little bit coming on, they might try and do it again then. But certainly it wouldn't be a practice to be done like every day for weeks or anything
I
like
see.
that.
I see.
It would just sort of be as needed, and with a focus on making sure that the fascia is having a chance to recover before you do it again.
Going again.
Yeah.
So with something like anxiety, it'd be a tool you could use when you're having, or your child's having, a bit of a struggle with anxiety, but not necessarily a daily tool.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Interesting. And how about
Yeah.
something like that's actually on the skin, like eczema or psoriasis? Would you avoid it in that sort of
Yes,
situation? Yes.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And would you move towards something, some other type of sort of on skin treatment, like cupping or anything like that for eczema, or do you completely avoid that?
Yeah, with things like cupping and gua sha, you would completely avoid it.
Yeah.
You may not avoid it with the needles though. So you may use the needles to kind of stimulate that area for healing. Yeah. So not so much like necessarily putting the needles right in the eczema itself. You may surround the area, or there is like this particular needling technique that's very quick and gentle, that you might kind of pepper the area with a little bit just to kind of, like I say, stimulate the skin to just bring some more healing to that area.
Yeah.
But then you would probably use, especially with eczema, for example, or psoriasis, nutrition and herbs become huge to kind of
Yes.
get rid of the root cause, and then using topical herbs for the sort of acute symptoms.
Symptoms.
Yeah.
What are some of the herbs that you would use for the acute symptoms, if I can ask you that question?
Oh, yeah. So there's what you would generally use. So for some people, it's just a matter of using like a really good organic oil, especially when the skin's wet. But then the herbs that can be used is so saffora root is really good for if you're going to do it topically, for like itch and redness. There's this Chinese herb that's like called purple grass. That's really lovely for red and that kind as well. And then angelica root is another one. So for example, I make like an ointment where I infuse all three of those into organic olive oil, add some beeswax, and then that becomes like an ointment that people can use. But I've also given herbs to people to use as like a wash as well. So there's different ways that people can do that. Yeah. And it depends too, because eczema is so interesting, right? Like it can manifest in so many different ways. Like for some people, it's really, really itchy and dry, and for other people, it's like really oozy and a wet rash. So then that will factor in on what herbs
What
you
herbs
use.
you use? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. And so the herbs that you mentioned, is that something that people would be able to pick up and sort of make their own salve at home?
They could. I think it's really intimidating for a lot of people, but they certainly can. Like any of the herb shops that you see, like especially the Chinese herb shops, will often sell things in its raw format.
Right.
And oftentimes they'll be labeled in English as well. And yeah, you can actually, like, angelica root is a really lovely one. It's usually you can actually find it often in like Asian grocery stores.
Okay.
It don't even have to be in a specific herb shop. Like I've seen it in yeah, Asian grocery stores quite frequently. And yeah, people can definitely work with, if they're making their own salves already and they know how to infuse oils and stuff. And if not, there's actually like a ton of resources on how to do that.
There are, yeah. There's lots of YouTube videos.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I think this idea again, like this idea that only experts are allowed to do with herbs and make these kinds of things is really going to the wayside, and people are realizing that these are things that people have done in their homes for thousands of years.
Yes.
Yeah.
What about something like a Community Foods or somewhere like that? They have a fairly large bulk herb sort of section. Would they carry something like that, do you think?
They probably wouldn't have the purple grass or the Sephora root, but they definitely have angelica root, I'm sure.
Well, there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
It would just be in a different cut. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that. And so basically the way that one works is it is a blood tonic. And the idea with eczema is that often we're, quote, blood deficient. Doesn't mean that there's like not enough volume of blood in the body, obviously, because that would be a much more severe condition.
Yeah.
But the idea is that blood in the body in Chinese medicine is nourishing, moistening, cooling. And so when those functions are not there, and that might manifest in Western medicine as like low hemoglobin or low iron, or it might manifest as absolutely nothing on a blood test. So when that's not there, the skin becomes dry. It's not able to protect itself from things that it might be slightly allergic to, or that kind of thing. So the idea with it is if we use that, it's very moistening to the skin and very like nourishing. So that this would be more specifically for like the eczema that's very dry and itchy.
Right.
Like angelica root would be really nice for that.
Really nice for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what I like too is when you're taking things topically, it's sort of a nice way to start, right? It's not as scary as when we're taking things internally. There's a lot of safety concerns and that kind of thing. So then it does, I think.
Herbs, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think it does warrant consultation with someone who's studied, but topically, especially if you're making like a fairly weak infusion in the oil, you can sort of work up to it, do your research. There's a little bit, it's a nice entryway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, one thing I need to make sure that I ask about before we run out of time here is ear seeds. What is ear seeds?
Oh, I love ear seeds. So ear seeds are basically literally seeds. So they come in different formats, and they can be varicella seeds, or they can actually be like kind of metal, like so they can be silver or gold plated beads.
Okay.
That are really, really small, and then they have a small adhesive on them that then they're sort of stuck onto the surface of the ear. So the seed actually acts as an acupressure. So it's not puncturing the skin in any way. It's just acting like an acupressure. And the idea is that the ear is a microcosm of the entire body. So every part of the body is represented on the ear. And so you can put these seeds into the ear with these little they're basically like stickers. And then the person can push on the seed and push it into that point of the ear that it's been put on. And so they can be useful in lots of different ways. And like I say, they come in lots of different formats, from like literal plant seeds to gold. And you can even get ones with like Swarovski crystals on them and stuff. Like it gets really fancy.
Wow, yeah.
And basically what you're doing throughout the day is you're pushing on this point prophylactically, like you're just kind of pushing on it as you think of it, or you're doing it when you need it. And it can be used for things like pain in the body. I've seen some really interesting success with it with like mouth dryness, even if that mouth dryness is caused by like a medicine that someone's taking or a procedure that they're having done that's causing it. So yeah, like moistening the mouth. It's one reason I use it the most probably though is for that mental health piece, that relaxation piece. So putting points in the ear that are really relaxing for people who are having trouble sleeping, who are experiencing anxiety. They're really lovely because it actually gives them something physically to do as well.
Right, yeah.
And kind of prolongs the treatment beyond when they're just physically with me. So so they're really they look really lovely. Like they're just little, sometimes people don't even notice them, especially if they don't have like giant crystals on them.
Right.
And so people just, massage them in as they want, and then they just fall off eventually, depending on the person. That'll depend on the speed. And some people, if they don't like them for any reason, they can take them off. But we're seeing them used too for things like quitting smoking, like things like that just sort of need that everyday enhancement as well, or that gives someone something they can do in the moment that they're experiencing discomfort. And so they can be really useful. I've even actually talked to someone who was a runner who started using them on the lung spot while she was running. So yeah, there's a lot of different applications. What I find is that some people love them, just like absolutely love them, like always make sure to remind me to put them in. And then some people are kind of like, or they can actually get kind of tender for some people. And so they don't always want to leave them in. But yeah, and then the person can really decide too what pressure they want. So they can, really, really push on it if they want, or they can just give it a little gentle stimulation. But it really is decided by them, which is nice as well.
Yeah, you're in the driver's seat. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Nice. Absolutely.
So one last question. We are up to our 1 hour time period, and I hope that you have just a couple of minutes to answer this question for me as you talk about the stimulating of that through the ear and how it's this microcosm. It also, the question jumps into my head. I work a lot with people who have SIBO, and of course the migratory motor complex, the vagus nerve is involved with that. So, would acupuncture or these ear seeds or anything like that be helpful in helping to stimulate that vagus nerve issue?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have a few patients with SIBO, and I think it's really lovely. And we can do all kinds of different things to stimulate that vagus nerve. And I think what's really neat too is that, one of the theories, as I said at the very beginning, is that acupuncture interacts most intimately with the neurological system. So I think that that's a really lovely piece for that as well. And I like it too, because what I've seen for patients that are experiencing that is that it gives another tool. So they might be doing, say, an herbal protocol with their naturopath, and then they'll come and see me, and we'll do some Chinese medicine nutrition stuff, we'll do the acupuncture, we'll do all that stuff, and then together that creates like a really lovely treatment plan. But yeah, definitely, and you see it even in other vagus nerve stuff as well, for example, like people who are having constipation because of that. So yeah, definitely we can use needles, we can use the acupuncture, we can even use things like moxibustion to really stimulate that neurological system. And what's really neat actually is acupuncture is like a really amazing tool for neurological stuff. Like even if you think about something like a stroke, acupuncture is like one of the most highly recommended things for that, especially when nothing else has worked. Like it's the one thing that sort of can be pulled in after the fact. So I think, yeah, definitely the answer is, in my opinion, very much. So it can help with that.
Great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I will. I'm going to follow up with that for you. Use you as a source, if I may, for some of my clients who might need help with that for their kids.
Please, yeah, absolutely. And people can also just email me too if if this brings up more questions for them. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's a perfect segue. Let's get your contact information in there. So how can they get a hold of you?
Perfect. Yeah. So my email is my name. So it's Erin@LegareTremblay.ca.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there a website they can visit you at?
Absolutely. So at the moment, I'm still on my clinic website. I don't have my own yet, but it's just yourwell.ca. So the letter U, the letter R, and then well.ca. So urwell.ca.
Okay. Perfect. And is there a clinic phone number that you can give out?
Yeah, absolutely. For people in Calgary, I'm at Urban Roots in Bowness, which is in the same building as the Light Cellar, for people who are familiar with that. And the number is 587-231-9331.
587-231...
9331.
9331. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Just writing that down for my notes for later.
Thank you.
And do you do distance appointments or only work with people locally?
Ooh, that is a really interesting question, which actually has not come up yet.
Okay.
So distance stuff is certainly doable, especially if people live in the province of Alberta. Okay. So outside of that, we would actually have to look at legislation based on what my regulatory body is here and whether that fits. So there is like a cross Canada exam process, but I think we're still trying to figure out the nitty-gritties around how jurisdiction works and stuff. Right. And certainly for someone who's living outside of the country, it would probably not be possible.
Okay, so if somebody is outside of the country and they've heard this interview and they're interested in finding somebody for this, is there a good resource they can go to find trustworthy practitioners?
Unfortunately, none that I know of. They would just have to sort of look in their area and see who's practicing. And I'm not sure how it works in every area. In Alberta and in Canada, there is a difference between someone who is a registered acupuncturist and someone who is a TCMD. So there's people who have TCMP or TCMD or like anything like that after the name, mean they have a little bit more education.
Okay, good.
And then there are certain provinces that also will register those different things.
Yeah.
But often I think the most acupuncturists and TCMDs will set up like a meet and greet. So if you're kind of unsure or you're not sure, like one of the best things is just to talk to other people. Does anyone else have, an acupuncturist or TCMD that they're working with that they like and trust? And if not, looking at like reviews online, and also, just set up like a 15-minute free meet and greet, and see if that person feels good or not. Like if they feel like a safe person, ask them some different questions if you want, even to kind of get a sense of their knowledge or safety. This is actually one of the things I've noticed doesn't happen very often. Like nobody ever asks me like how I disinfect my cups or, things like that. So like feel free to ask those questions and make sure that that person is, on top of, and see if there's other values you have. Like just ask them point blank, does that value fit with them? Because we're just like other professionals, we each have sort of our own baggage or our own ideas about things, right? So
align in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect. That's helpful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time out of your practice to come and chat with us today. I really appreciate it. I think it's been very informative.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Okay, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody for tuning in for another episode. And we will be back in another 2 weeks with another episode of Kids Health Revolution, the podcast. Look forward to talking with you guys soon. If you have any comments or questions about this, feel free to contact Erin directly, or you can always comment on the podcast post or get a hold of me in the various ways you know how to get a hold of me. And make sure you subscribe to the show so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. We'll talk to you really soon.
Thank you for listening to Kids Health Revolution Radio. Before you go, take a minute to subscribe to the show and to become a free member of the Kids Health Revolution community. Lots of great people, information, and bonuses waiting for you at www.kidshealthrevolution.com. The information on this show is for information and educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or otherwise replace medical advice.